The grand ballroom was the kind of place that didn't just have light, but seemed to produce it from within its own walls. Crystal chandeliers, each one looking like a frozen waterfall of diamonds, hung from a ceiling so high it felt like its own little sky. The light caught on the gold trim of the wallpaper, on the delicate stems of champagne flutes, and most of all, on the people. They moved in a slow, sparkling swirl, women in dresses that whispered when they walked. Men in tuxedos so sharp, they looked like they could cut the air. It was the annual gala for the Metropolitan Conservatory, the biggest night for the city's classical music scene. Everyone who was anyone, or who wanted to be someone, was here. The air buzzed with low conversations about stock portfolios and summer homes, punctuated by the clink of fine china and the occasional burst of practiced laughter. In this world of polished marble and effortless wealth, she moved like a shadow. Her name was on a badge that nobody read. Elena. She wore the uniform, a simple, knee-length black dress, comfortable black shoes. Her dark hair tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail. She was one of several servers, part of the evening's necessary machinery, as invisible as the wires behind the walls. Her job was to see without being seen, to anticipate a need and fill it without disrupting the scene. Her feet, inside those sensible shoes, ached with a deep, throbbing tiredness. She'd been on them since noon, helping set up. Her lower back was a knot of tension. She carried a heavy silver tray now, its weight familiar in her hands, as she glided along the edges of the crowd. She offered miniature works of art, tiny tartlets with glistening caviar, perfect squares of beef Wellington, glasses of champagne whose bubbles rose in endless, cheerful streams. "Thank you," a woman in emerald green murmured without looking at her, taking a glass. A man in a velvet jacket waved her away absently, his attention locked on a conversation about yacht lengths. Elena's face was a mask of polite neutrality. Her eyes, a warm brown, were downcast, watching the floor, the hems of gowns, the shuffling of expensive shoes. But every so often, they would lift. They would travel across the sea of silk and satin, past the glittering jewelry, to find the one still. Silent center of the room. The grand piano. It stood on a low, spotlighted stage, a beast of polished ebony, a Steinway concert grand. It wasn't just an instrument. It was a presence. To these people, it was a beautiful piece of furniture, a symbol of the high culture they were supporting tonight. To Elena, it was something else entirely. It was a room in a house she hadn't entered in years. It was a landscape she knew by touch. It was a friend and a ghost. A small, sharp pain, not in her feet but in her chest, would pinch her every time she looked at it. She would quickly look away, focusing on a crumb on a tray, on refilling a napkin bowl. But it always pulled her back. Her hands, as she balanced the tray, were interesting hands. They were capable, strong-looking, with long fingers. There was a faint, silvery scar across the back of her right knuckle, an old thing. A few of the older, more observant patrons might have noticed a slight callus on the pads of her fingers, but they'd likely mistake it for work from some ordinary job. They didn't look like the soft, cared-for hands of the patrons. But they didn't quite look like a typical waitress's hands either. The buzz in the room shifted. The main event was about to begin. The crowd began to drift toward the rows of velvet-seated chairs arranged before the piano. The night's performer was a big deal virtuoso named Alexander Thorne, a man with wild gray hair and a reputation for fiery, dramatic interpretations. His picture was in the program notes. Everyone held dot as the guests settled. Elena and the other servers melted back to the walls, standing near the swinging doors that led to the frantic heat of the kitchen. This was their moment to pause, to rest their feet for a few minutes, to watch. The host, a jovial man with a perfectly trimmed beard, took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice rich with confidence and good wine. "What a privilege to be here, surrounded by such patrons of the true, the beautiful, the sublime. Tonight, we are graced by a master, a man whose fingers speak the language of the gods. Please welcome the magnificent Alexander Thorne." Thunderous applause. Thorne walked out, gave a quick, cocky bow, and sat at the Steinway. He paused for a moment, hands in his lap, building the anticipation. Then he launched in. The music was loud, powerful, technically incredible. It was a storm of notes, a cascade of sound that filled the vast ballroom. The audience watched, mesmerized by the speed, by the passion of his swaying body. Elena watched too, from the shadow of the service door. Her head was tilted slightly to the wealthy spectators. It was a flawless performance. To Elena, listening with a different part of her brain, it was like watching a master chef use every expensive ingredient in the kitchen at once. Impressive, but overwhelming. She could hear the effort. She could hear the desire to astonish. The music wasn't flowing through him. He was wrestling it into submission. She didn't realize her fingers were moving. Resting against her black dress, her right hand was tracing faint, invisible patterns on her thigh, the shape of a scale, the arc of a phrase Thorne had just played, but slightly different. A simpler, softer version. It was a habit so old she didn't know she was doing it. A fellow server, a young man with tired eyes, nudged her gently. "Pretty amazing, huh?" He whispered. Elena blinked, pulling her hand still. "Yes," she whispered back, her voice barely audible. "Amazing." She wasn't being sarcastic. The skill was real. But in her mind, she was somewhere else. She was in a small, sunlit room with a battered upright piano, the sound of traffic coming through an open window. She was playing not for applause, but for the sheer, quiet joy of a melody that felt like her own heartbeat. The memory was so vivid, it was a physical ache, a longing that was sharper than the pain in her feet. The first piece ended. The applause was explosive. Thorne acknowledged it with a proud smile. For his encore, the mood shifted. He announced a Chopin nocturne. Something lyrical, intimate. He began. The stormy energy was gone, replaced by something meant to be tender. The first few minutes were lovely. But then, in a quiet, twisting passage where the left hand creates a whispering heartbeat under a fragile right-hand melody, it happened. His finger slipped. A note that was meant to be a soft, dark blue was a jarring, bright red. A few people in the audience, the ones who really knew the piece, shifted slightly in their seats. Thorne recovered, kept going. But the mistake had thrown him. The next few bars, which should have felt like a sigh, sounded careful, calculated. He was thinking now, not feeling. He was trying to be perfect again, and the heart of the piece was slipping away. Helena, against the wall, let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. It wasn't a sound of judgment, but of recognition. She knew that place. The place after a mistake, where you grip tighter and the music dies. Her face, for just a second, showed it a faint wince of shared frustration, a sorrow for the beautiful thing that was being lost. A socialite sitting near the aisle, an older woman draped in pearls, saw it. She saw the waitress's subtle reaction. Leaning over, she gave Elena a patronizing smile, her voice a sweet, cold whisper meant to put someone in their place. "Complex stuff, isn't it?" the woman said. A bit more complicated than clearing tables. Elena met the woman's eyes for a fraction of a second. There was no anger in her look, no defiance, just a quiet, profound depth that seemed out of place. She simply gave a small, polite nod, as she'd been trained to do, and looked back at the piano. But inside, the quiet spark that had been smoldering all night, fanned by the sight of the Steinway and the sound of the fractured Chopin, was beginning to glow a little brighter. Her hands, hanging at her sides now, curled softly into loose fists, then relaxed. She wasn't seeing the ballroom, the chandeliers, or the rich crowd anymore. She was only seeing the piano, and the distance between it and her, across that sea of polished floor, felt like the only distance that mattered in the world. The final, careful notes of the Chopin Nocturne faded into the thick, silent air of the ballroom. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then the applause began. It was polite, the kind that comes from an audience that knows it should clap, but isn't quite sure what it has just heard. It was scattered at first, then grew into a full, but decidedly unenthusiastic wave of noise. There were no cheers, no whistles, just the steady, respectful pattering of hands. Alexander Thorne stood from the piano bench. His smile was tight, pulled at the corners. He gave a short, sharp bow, his wild gray hair falling over his forehead. He could feel it. The room had cooled. The mistake, that one clumsy note in the delicate heart of the piece, had been a tiny crack in a dam. The emotion he had been holding back had all leaked out, and what was left was just technical skill, which to this crowd wasn't enough. They wanted magic, and he had given them a very well-made trick that they had seen go slightly wrong. From her spot by the service door, Elena watched him. She saw the frustration in the line of his shoulders. She knew that feeling too, the hollow, sick feeling after a performance that hadn't landed, when you know you are playing the notes, but not the music. A strange sense of sympathy, unexpected and sharp, pricked at her. He was just a man, up there, not a god. He had messed up. She found her own hands, resting on the cool metal of the door handle behind her back, and she curled her fingers gently, as if to release an old tension. The host, the man with the perfect beard, practically bounded back onto the stage, his face a mask of cheerful confidence, trying to steamroll over the awkwardness. He clapped Thorne on the back a little too heartily. Magnificent. Truly magnificent, Alexander. He boomed into the microphone, his voice too loud for the room's mood. The passion, the precision, a masterclass. The audience clapped a little more, out of duty. Thorne nodded, his smile not reaching his eyes. But you know, the host continued, turning to the crowd with a conspiratorial wink, we have such a discerning group of patrons here tonight. True lovers of the art. I'm sure there are many opinions in the room. Who among you is brave enough to offer a friendly critique of our maestro? He laughed, a booming sound that expected everyone to join in. It was a joke, of course. A safe, silly thing to say. No one would dare. The laughter that came back was thin and nervous. People shifted in their velvet chairs. It was an uncomfortable moment, made worse by the host's attempt to be charming. No one wanted to be called out. No one wanted to embarrass the performer, or themselves. Elena, in the shadows, felt a knot form in her stomach. The whole scene felt wrong. The pianist's shame, the host's bluster, the crowd's polite discomfort. It was like watching someone try to put a pretty bandage on a deep cut. The music itself felt forgotten, buried under all this social awkwardness. That quiet, glowing spark inside her flickered. The piece, that beautiful, sad Chopin, deserved better than to be the cause of all this. This nothing. Then, from a few feet to Elena's left, she heard it. The socialite in the pearls, the one who had whispered to her earlier, leaned toward her companion, a man with a neatly trimmed mustache. Her voice was a dry, carrying whisper, not meant for Elena, but Elena heard every word. See? Even the help noticed it was off, the woman said, a faint smirk in her voice. The girl winced right in the middle of the slow movement. Probably doesn't know a nocturne from a napkin, but even she could tell it was a bit of a train wreck. The words didn't feel mean, not exactly. They felt empty. They reduced the beautiful, complicated failure of the performance to gossip, and reduced Elena to a piece of the scenery that had accidentally made a funny face. That knot in Elena's stomach pulled tighter. It wasn't about being insulted. It was about the profound loneliness of it all. The music was alone. The pianist was alone. And she was alone, holding a truth in her body that no one in this sparkling room could see. The host was still chuckling on stage, filling the dead air. Come now, no takers? Not even a comment on the fiery interpretation? A strange calm settled over Elena. It was a feeling she remembered from a long time ago, from walking onto a stage under blinding lights. The noise of the world would fade away, and there would be only the task. The music. In this case, it wasn't about playing. It was about speaking. The words left her lips before her mind could fully catch up to the consequences. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. It cut through the murmur of the room like a single pure note. The B-flat in the second cadenza. The sound of her own voice in the quiet room seemed to startle her as much as anyone. She froze for a second. All at once, every head in the room turned. 200 pairs of eyes, glittering with curiosity, shock, and amusement, locked onto her. She was no longer a shadow. She was the absolute center of the universe. The host blinked, his smile stuck on his face. He hadn't expected an answer, and certainly not from her. I beg your pardon? Elena swallowed. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. But the path was chosen now. There was no stepping back into the shadows. She kept her eyes on the host, avoiding the sea of faces. The B-flat, she repeated, her voice gaining a little strength, but still quiet, almost conversational. In the second cadenza, right before the return of the main theme. It's written as a grace note, a whisper, a catch in the breath. She made a small, fluttery motion with her fingers. He played it like a full note, like a statement. It changes the feeling. It makes the grief sound angry. It's not supposed to be angry. A massive, profound silence swallowed the ballroom. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. You could hear the rustle of a dress as someone leaned forward. Alexander Thorne, on stage, was staring at her, his brow furrowed not in anger, but in intense, shocked concentration. He was replaying the passage in his mind. The host, completely out of his depth, let out a strained laugh. Well, a music critic in our midst. And from the culinary course. A few people in the audience tittered nervously, relieved by his attempt to make it a joke. He turned to Elena, putting on a show of mock seriousness. That's a very specific note to pick out, young lady. And I suppose, he said, the condescension tripping back into his voice, you could do it better? He said it to shut her down. He said it so she would mumble an apology, blush, and disappear. He expected her to crumble. Elena looked at him. Then, slowly, her gaze shifted to the piano, to the beautiful, silent Steinway. That old friend, that ghost. The distance across the floor didn't seem so vast anymore. It seemed like the only logical path. The spark inside her wasn't just glowing now. It was a steady flame. She didn't look at the host when she answered. She looked at the piano, and her voice was so soft everyone had to strain to hear it, yet it carried to the very back of the room. The piece isn't about being better, she said. It's not a competition. She paused, searching for the right words. It's about grief. Real grief. It's quiet and it aches, and it has empty spaces. You don't fill them with loud notes. You have to. You have to sit in the silence. Her words hung there, simple and devastating. The condescending smiles on a few faces faded. This was no longer a joke about an uppity waitress. On the stage, Alexander Thorne moved. He stepped away from the host, toward the edge of the stage closest to her. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He saw the tiredness, the plain dress, but he also saw the straightness of her spine and the quiet certainty in her eyes. He was a proud man, but he was, first and foremost, a musician. And she had just described the heart of the piece he had just failed to play. He didn't speak to the host. He spoke directly to her, his voice uncharacteristically quiet, stripped of its performer's bravado. "Please," he said, and he gestured to the piano bench. It wasn't a challenge. It was, astonishingly, a request. "Show us." The two words hung in the air, louder than any note the piano had played all night. Show us. A wave of sound, not of music, but of pure human reaction, swept through the ballroom. It was a gasp, a collective intake of breath, followed by a frantic, buzzing whisper that rose like the hum of a stirred beehive. Every single person was turned in their chair, necks craning, eyes wide with a mixture of shock, delight, and utter disbelief. This was no longer a gala. It was a drama unfolding in real time, and it was more thrilling than any concert. Elena stood frozen by the door. The sudden rush of attention was a physical pressure, like diving deep underwater. The calm that had let her speak was gone, replaced by a ringing in her ears. She could see the faces the socialite in pearls, with her hand over her mouth, the host's stunned and slightly panicked expression, the rows and rows of wealthy, expectant strangers. Their eyes felt like pinpricks of light. Her own feet, in their sensible black shoes, seemed rooted to the polished floor. A frantic, screaming voice in her head told her to run, to push through the service door behind her, back into the hot, noisy, anonymous safety of the kitchen, to leave this impossible situation and never look back. She could mutter an apology, claim she didn't actually play, and slip away. The story would become a funny anecdote they'd tell for weeks. Remember that crazy waitress who almost... But then she looked past them, past all the faces, past the glittering chandeliers, to the piano. The Steinway sat quietly on its little stage, waiting. The spotlight made its black surface look like still, deep water. It was the only familiar thing in the suddenly alien room. The pianist, Alexander Thorne, was still standing at the edge of the stage, his hand still extended toward the bench. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't angry. He looked curious and tired. He looked like a man who had just heard a secret spoken in a language only he understood. That look did something to her. It cut through the panic. It wasn't a challenge from an enemy. It was a question from a fellow traveler who had lost his way. He was offering her the instrument, not as a test, but as a tool to finish a conversation she had started. The buzzing in the room began to settle into a thick, anticipatory silence. They were waiting. The decision was a door, and she was standing in the doorway. She took a breath, so deep it felt like her first one all night. Then she moved. She didn't walk like a performer taking the stage. There was no grand, confident stride. She walked as she always had, quietly, directly, with a slight weariness in her step. Her focus was entirely on the path ahead. The sea of tables and chairs parted for her, as servers and guests alike shifted to let her through. She heard the rustle of fabric, a stifled cough. But it all seemed far away, Dot, as she passed the table where the socialite in pearls sat. The woman's eyes were like saucers, her earlier smugness completely erased by pure astonishment. Elena didn't see her, Dot. Her heart wasn't pounding with excitement. It was beating a slow, heavy rhythm of dread and something else, something she hadn't felt in years, a terrible, vulnerable need. With every step closer to the piano, the mask of the waitress, the invisible woman, crumbled away. She felt naked under the lights. She reached the steps to the low stage. For a second, she paused, looking up at the piano. It seemed larger now, more powerful. Thorne took a few steps back, giving her space, his eyes never leaving her. She climbed the 3 steps. The wooden floor of the stage creaked softly under her weight. Now the entire room was spread out below her, a landscape of upturned, silent faces. The heat of the spotlights was warm on her skin. She stood beside the piano for a moment, not touching it. This was the moment. The point of no return. In the kitchen, she was Elena, who restocked the mineral water and knew how to clear a tray of champagne flutes without spilling a drop. In this spotlight, who was she? She reached out a hand. Not to the keys, but to the side of the piano, letting her fingertips brush the cool, polished wood. It was a greeting. An old silent hello. Then. She sat. She didn't perform a pianist's ritual, no cracking of knuckles, no dramatic raising of the hands. She simply adjusted the bench slightly, pulling it closer. The movement was practical, intimate. She placed her feet on the pedals, finding their familiar give. She let her hands rest in her lap for a second, looking down at them. The calluses on her fingertips, the faint scar. These were the hands of a worker. But they were also the hands that had once known this language better than any other. She closed her eyes. The ballroom, the people, the expectation, it all dissolved into darkness. The only sound was the blood rushing in her own ears. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she wasn't in a gala. She was somewhere else. A small apartment. The smell of old books and coffee. The feeling of loss so profound it had no shape, just a weight that lived in her chest. The music she was about to play wasn't just notes on a page by a man who died centuries ago. It was the sound of that weight. It was the closest thing to speaking about the unspeakable that she had ever found. She opened her eyes. The change was instant and total. The weariness was gone. The uncertainty was gone. Her face, which had been so carefully neutral all evening, was now alive with a quiet, deep focus. Her eyes, looking at the keys, but seeming to see through them, held a story no one in the room knew. She lifted her hands. It was not a showy gesture. It was simply the necessary movement to bring them to where they needed to be. Her right hovered over the treble keys, her left over the bass. For a final suspended second, there was perfect stillness. The entire world was holding its breath. Then she began. The first note was not a note, but a whisper. The softest, most gentle pressing of a key. It was the sound of a single drop of water falling in a silent room. It was not perfect. It was human. It was fragile. She didn't attack the nocturne. She invited it. Her left hand laid down the heartbeat rhythm, but it wasn't a mechanical pulse. It was uneven, breathing, like a heart weighed down by memory. When her right hand entered with the melody, it wasn't the pristine, technically correct line Thorne had played. It was a voice. It cracked in places. It hesitated, then pushed forward. It sang of something deeply private. She played the B flat, the one she had spoken of. It was indeed a grace note of fleeting, sighing touch that colored the main note like a shadow passing over a face, and then it was gone. It wasn't a mistake or a statement. It was a caught breath, a tear that doesn't fall. The audience was not just hearing the difference. They were feeling it in their bones. The technical perfection of the earlier performance was forgotten. This was not about listening to music. This was about being invited into a feeling. Some people sat up straighter. Others seemed to sink into their chairs, their faces softening. A few, in the very front, had tears welling up, though they couldn't have said why. Elena was gone. The woman on the bench was a vessel. Her body moved with the music, but it was small movements, a slight lean, a tilt of the head. Her face reflected the shifts in the melody, a slight tightening at a moment of pain, a subtle, almost invisible release at a moment of fleeting peace. She was not performing for them. She was simply, finally, telling the truth. And the truth played on a piano under a spotlight, was the most astonishing thing any of them had ever witnessed. The silence in the room was no longer waiting. It was reverent. It was listening. The music wasn't coming from the piano. It seemed to be coming from the air itself, from the silence she had pulled apart and given shape to. The final section of the nocturne arrived, a series of delicate, falling notes that should have sounded sad, but in her hands sounded like acceptance. A gentle letting go. The last chord, a complex whisper of sound from the left hand, faded into nothingness. Her right hand lifted slowly from the keys, the final note sustaining in the pedal until it dissolved into the quiet of the room. For a long moment, there was absolutely no sound. Then, it wasn't an applause that started, but a kind of collective exhale, a rustle of movement as people seemed to remember they had bodies. And then the clapping began. It was different from anything that had happened all night. It wasn't polite. It wasn't impressed. It was stunned. It was grateful. It started in pockets and swelled into a roaring wave that hit the stage like a physical force. People were on their feet, their faces etched with amazement. The sound was thunderous, filling the vast space until it vibrated in the crystal of the chandeliers. Elena blinked as if waking from a deep sleep. The world rushed back in the lights, the heat, the deafening noise. She looked out at the standing, cheering crowd, and a wave of disorientation hit her. She looked down at her hands, resting now in her lap, as if surprised to find them there. The spell was broken. The vessel was empty. She was just a woman in a waitress uniform on a stage, with 200 strangers shouting for her. Her first instinct was to shrink, to get up, bow quickly, and escape. But before she could move, a figure stepped into the edge of her vision. Alexander Thorne was standing a few feet away. He was not clapping. He was staring at her with an intensity that was almost frightening. His earlier pride and frustration were completely gone. In their place was a raw, unguarded look of recognition. He took 2 steps toward the piano, the applause washing around him. He didn't shout. He simply spoke, and though his voice was low, she could see the words on his lips. "Your name," he said. "What is your name?" Before she could even think to answer, a commotion came from the front row. A man in his 60s, with sharp glasses and a shock of white hair, was pushing his way out of his seat and toward the stage steps. He moved with a frantic energy, ignoring the people around him. It was a famous music critic, a man whose words could make or break careers, known for his brutal honesty and deep knowledge. He had been at the gala, not just as a guest, but as a journalist. He scrambled onto the stage. His eyes locked on Elena. He held the evening's glossy program in one hand, and he was frantically circling something on it with a pen he'd pulled from his pocket. He stopped a few feet from her, looking from her face to his program and back again. "Torres," he said, his voice hoarse with excitement. "Elena Torres. The prodigy. You studied at the conservatory here. You won the International Chopin competition in Warsaw 10 years ago. You were the one everyone was talking about." He held up the program. On the back page, in the small print listing the conservatory's notable alumni, her name was there, halfway down a column. He had circled it violently in black ink. A new, different murmur swept through the crowd. The name, once spoken, began to travel from person to person. Older patrons, those deeply connected to the music world, nodded slowly, memories clicking into place. They remembered the stories. The young woman with the breathtaking touch who had disappeared from the stage just as her career was set to explode. There had been rumors, burnout, injury, a personal tragedy, but no one knew for sure. She had simply vanished. "You disappeared," the critic said, stepping closer. Not as a critic now, but as a fan, as a confused historian of a mystery. After your mother passed, you canceled your debut with the symphony. You just walked away. On the bench, Elena flinched. It was the smallest movement, a slight tightening around her eyes. She hadn't heard that name, her real name, spoken in a public place in years. It felt like a key turning in a long locked door, and the sound was painful. She didn't confirm or deny it. She just looked at the man, her expression unreadable. Thorne, listening, put a hand to his forehead. "Torres," he repeated, whispering it to himself. "My God, I heard your recording. The mazurkas, they were perfect." He said perfect, not like a compliment, but like a diagnosis. He looked at her uniform, at the tiredness that had settled back into her posture now that the music was done. "Why are you here?" he asked, echoing the question now on everyone's mind. His voice was thick with genuine confusion. "Why are you serving drinks?" The applause had finally begun to die down, replaced by a rapt, breathless silence. Everyone leaned in to hear her answer. This was the real encore. Elena looked from Thorne's bewildered face to the critic's eager one, then out over the sea of wealthy, expectant faces. These were the people who bought the tickets, who funded the concert halls, who lived in the world she had left behind. She took a slow breath. "The music I played for them," she said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying in the hushed room. She didn't gesture to the crowd. She didn't need to. That music, it was for a thing, for a review, for a competition, for a career. It was a product. She paused, looking at her hands again. After a while, I couldn't hear it anymore. All I could hear was the silence between the notes, and it was empty. She lifted her head, and her eyes seemed to look past the walls of the ballroom. I needed to forget how to play for an audience. I needed to remember what real silence sounded like. The kind that isn't just waiting for the next note. The kind you live in. She gestured faintly around the room, at the trays, at her own simple dress. This is quiet. It's hard, but it's simple. There's no performance here. You just are." She stood up from the piano bench. The movement was final. The performance was over. "I played tonight," she said, looking directly at Thorne, "because you asked about the music. Not about the technique. Not about the mistake. You asked about the grief. And that," she trailed off, a faint, almost sad ghost of a smile, touching her lips for the first time all night. "That I remembered." She gave no grand bow. She offered no explanation for where she'd been or what she would do next. She simply turned and walked to the steps of the stage. The crowd parted for her again, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't anticipation. It was awe, mixed with a kind of shame. They had looked right through her all night. She walked past the socialite in pearls, who now looked pale and small. She walked past the host, who stood with his mouth slightly open, his microphone hanging uselessly at his side. She walked straight for the service door at the back of the ballroom, the one that led to the kitchen dot. No one tried to stop her. No one offered her a recording contract from the stage. No one rushed forward with a business card. The power of what they had just witnessed, the playing, and the quiet devastation of her words had stripped them of their usual reflexes. They could only watch her go dot. She pushed through the swinging door, and the world changed instantly. The bright, quiet grandeur of the ballroom was replaced by the chaotic, steaming heat of the kitchen. The air smelled of roasted meat and dish soap. The din of clattering pots and shouted orders was a wall of sound. For a moment, she just stood there, letting the familiar noise wash over her. Then she walked to the staff alcove. She ignored the stares of the other servers and the chefs, their faces full of questions. She took her coat from a simple hook, a plain, worn thing. She slipped it on dot She didn't look back. She pushed open the heavy delivery door that led to the alley behind the grand building. The cold night air hit her face, a shocking, wonderful relief after the heat inside. The sounds of the city-distant traffic, a siren, the rumble of a subway deep underground, were loud and real. She stood for a minute, breathing it in. Then she started walking, not toward the bus stop she usually used, but just walking, her hands deep in her pockets, the echoes of the music and the noise of the gala finally, completely left behind. The cold air of the alley was a shock, but a clean one. It smelled of wet pavement and distant city smells, a world away from the perfumed, climate-controlled ballroom. She walked, the sound of her own footsteps on the concrete, the only rhythm she needed. The noise of the kitchen door swinging shut behind her felt like the closing of a very heavy book. She didn't go far. Just a few blocks, to a small, all-night diner that glowed with a tired yellow light. It was a place for taxi drivers finishing their shifts, for night owls, for people who needed a cup of coffee and a few minutes of quiet. She slid into a booth by the window, the vinyl seat creaking under her. A waitress, an older woman with a kind face and tired eyes, brought her a coffee without asking. She gave Alana a small, knowing nod. It was the kind of place where you didn't have to explain anything. Elena wrapped her hands around the thick ceramic mug, feeling its heat seep into her fingers. She stared out the window at the passing traffic, her mind perfectly, strangely empty. There was no panic, no grand planning, no replaying the night's events. It was as if the act of playing, of finally speaking that musical truth, had drained a reservoir of tension she had been carrying for years. For the first time in a very long time, her head was quiet. Back in the ballroom, the story was just beginning to boil over. The critic was on his phone in a corner, talking a mile a minute to his editor. The host was trying desperately to regain control of the evening, announcing the start of the auction in a voice that sounded brittle and false. Small groups clustered together, talking in hushed, excited tones. The socialite in pearls was holding court, now claiming she had sensed something special about the girl all along. Alexander Thorne had not moved from the stage. He stood by the piano, staring at the empty bench. He wasn't thinking about reviews or his own wounded pride. He was thinking about the sound of that B-flat. How, in her hands, it hadn't been a note at all, but a breath. A human breath. He slowly packed his sheet music, his movements thoughtful. The gala for him was over. The morning after brought a different kind of noise. The critic's column was the first to hit. It wasn't a review of the gala. The headline read, "The Lost Nocturne, a genius found in a waitress's uniform." It spoke of the performance not as a curiosity, but as a seismic event. He wrote about the technical mastery, yes, but mostly he wrote about the silence. "She didn't perform, Chopin," he wrote. "She invited us into his room and hers, and showed us they were the same room. It was the most honest music I have heard in a decade." By midday, the story was everywhere. Not just in the arts sections, but on news sites, social media, morning talk shows. The video, shaky and captured on several phones from the back of the room, went viral. It was grainy, the sound tinny, but the power of the moment translated. The contrast was the story, the elegant room, the wealthy crowd, the simple uniform, and then that soul-wrenching music. People didn't just share it. They wrote long comments about it, about art, about unseen talent, about burnout. Offers began to materialize, floating through channels to try and find her. A major record label wanted an album, the Waitress Sessions. A famous talk show hosted an exclusive interview. The Symphony, the very one whose debut she had canceled, called her old manager, asking if she might be available for reconsideration. Her old manager, who hadn't heard from her in years, was frantically trying her last known number, but Elena was offline. She was unreachable. She had a cheap phone she used only for texts and calls about shifts. The storm of the outside world crashed against a silent shore. That morning, she woke up in her small apartment. The sun was coming through the blinds, painting stripes of light on the plain wooden floor. It was a quiet, simple space. A few plants, a bookshelf filled with well-worn paperbacks, a small, old upright piano pushed against the wall in the corner. It wasn't the beautiful monster from the gala. It was a humble thing, its dark wood scarred, a few of its keys slightly chipped. For years, that piano had been furniture. A placeholder. A memory she walked past. Sometimes she'd dust it. Sometimes she'd feel a pang so sharp she'd have to leave the room. This morning was different. She made her tea. She sat in her usual chair by the window and drank it slowly, watching the city wake up. The world was buzzing about her, and she had no idea. The feeling from the diner was still there. A deep, solid calm. Her eyes drifted to the piano. Last night, she had played for the first time in years, but it had been for a reason. To answer a question. To finish a sentence. It had been for others, in a way, even though it felt personal. Now, there was no question. No audience. No reason at all. She finished her tea, washed the cup, and set it on the rack to dry. She walked across the sunlit floor and stopped in front of the old piano. She reached out and lifted the fallboard, the way she had 1,000 times in another life. The keys, yellowed with age, stared back at her. She didn't sit down to practice. She didn't sit down to prepare anything. She just sat down. She placed her fingers on the keys, not in any formal position, but just resting them there. They were cold. What did she want to play? Nothing. Everything. She started not with Chopin, not with any piece she knew by heart. She started with a single chord, a simple major chord. She held it, listening to the sound of her own instrument, which was slightly out of tune. It buzzed a little. It was real. Then another chord, one that clashed with the first, creating a tension. She let them hang in the quiet air of her apartment. Then, her left hand began a pattern, something slow and wandering, not a rhythm from sheet music, but a rhythm from her own pulse. Her right hand started to trace a melody over the top. It was hesitant at first, searching. A few notes, then a pause. Then a few more. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't sad. It was just sound. Her sound. She wasn't thinking about grace notes or interpretations. She wasn't thinking about an audience or a critic. She was just listening. To the feel of the keys under her calloused fingertips. To the slight groan of the old pedals. To the way the simple melody she was inventing, right there in that moment, seemed to twine with the stripe of sunlight on the floor. She played for maybe 20 minutes. It wasn't a song. It was a conversation. With the instrument. With the morning. With herself. There were wrong notes. There were moments where she stopped, shrugged, and tried something else. Once, she even let out a soft laugh at a particularly clumsy transition. When she finally stopped, letting the last faint vibration fade into the room, she felt it. Not triumph. Not relief. Something simpler. She felt like she had come home. She closed the fallboard gently. She got up and went about her day. She did not put on her waitress uniform. She wore her own clothes, a soft sweater, a pair of old jeans. She knew somehow that she would not go back to the gala or to any job like it. That chapter was closed. In the afternoon, she took a walk. She passed a newsstand. Her own face, a blurry still from the viral video, was on the cover of a tabloid next to the headline, "Maestro in Apron." She kept walking. It had nothing to do with her. The story the world wanted was over. It had a clean, dramatic arc. The discovery, the triumph, the return. But that was their story. Her story was quieter, and it was just beginning. She walked back to her apartment as the sun began to set. She knew there would be decisions to make. Phone calls to answer, perhaps. Questions from the outside world that would eventually find their way to her door. But that was for later. For now, there was just the quiet apartment, and the old, waiting piano, and the unspoken understanding that the music, from now on, was hers. To play or not to play. To share or to keep. It was no longer a ghost. It was just a part of her life again. And that was all she had needed, all along.